Hi, I'm Davy. I'm awesome. And welcome to Davy's Awesome Wrestling, where I review wrestling related things, all from the perspective of a fan, not an insider. So this week we had the debut on Peacock of the documentary about Bray Wyatt. Normally I don't really do documentaries that are brand new, but this one felt appropriate. As like I said, it came out this week in 2024. And it was narrated by none other than Mark Calloway, The Undertaker himself. The documentary Bray Wyatt, Becoming Immortal. From the beginning, you knew this documentary was going to tug at your heartstrings, as it opened with Bray Wyatt's brother, Taylor Rotundo, also known as Uncle Howdy, also known as Bo Dallas, talking about his brother. And it also gave us some previously unreleased interviews with Bray Wyatt, some dating back to when he was in NXT, some just of him actually calling himself Bray Wyatt, or even The Fiend, just stuff that had never been released before. And it goes into how he was a third-generation superstar, as he was the grandson of Blackjack Mulligan, and how his father, Mike Rotundo, mostly known as IRS, married Blackjack Mulligan's daughter, who was a part of the Wyndham family, which is where the real person Bray Wyatt got his first name, Wyndham, which was her maiden name, Wyndham Rotunda. And it goes into, obviously, his sci-fi horror movie obsession, which would later play a big role in his characters. Talking about since the time he was a little kid, he was obsessed with movies like Beetlejuice and Ghostbusters, which I can relate. He also used to love to read the Goosebumps novels. Don't really relate as much to that. I read a couple of them. They were kind of cool, but I wasn't that into them. But Beetlejuice, Ghostbusters, apparently like him, yeah, I would sit there and quote the entire movie. And it went into how he was a big kid, but a top athlete, a football star, and an amateur wrestler in high school. As was his brother, Taylor, who didn't quite achieve as much as he did as a high school athlete, but was on his way. But how after high school, he got a developmental contract with WWE, and Wyndham said, you know what, I want to do this with you. So even though Wyndham was on his way to a football career, wasn't really what he wanted to be a wrestler, quit football, and got himself a developmental contract as well. And heck, this is my earliest memory of them being in FCW as Duke and Bo Rotundo. Obviously a playoff of Dukes of Hazzard. And at the time I was thinking like it was an interesting tag team, but we'll see if this goes anywhere. Now obviously I didn't get to watch a lot of FCW. I didn't live in Florida. I would only see the occasional episode that was posted on YouTube or something. But then less than a year after being in FCW, tagging with his brother, they go into most everybody's first experience of Bray Wyatt, which was on Season 2 of NXT as Husky Harris. And not that many people liked that, including Wyndham Rotunda. I remember at the time seeing Husky Harris and watching him, and it's funny now looking back, thinking about some of his promos during NXT, thinking about how you could hear Bray Wyatt wanting to come out, but at the time, of course, you didn't notice it. You just were like, there's something in this guy. Because I remember that. I remember liking the wrestler, but hating that name. It was just a terrible, terrible name. Like, probably the worst NXT name they came up with during those reality show days. And keep in mind, they had Michael McGillicuddy and Skip Sheffield. But then it also goes into around that time, him and his first wife, Samantha, had their first daughter, Kaiten. Sadly, though, she gave birth while he was in Europe on the European tour. He did get to listen to the whole birth on his cell phone, which, as a father, that would cut. Because, of course, that's something, but you want to be there. But then it also goes into how, of course, Husky Harris was not working. I don't think that had any chance of ever working. So he goes back to developmental. This time, it is NXT, and it's just NXT. It's no longer a reality show. It's being run by Triple H. And he starts coming up with the character Bray Wyatt and how he came up with it. Originally based off of a friend of his named Bray Wyatt, who was kind of nutty and out there. And then later into forming what would become the Wyatt family, starting with Luke Harper, the late great John Huber, and Eric Rowan. Both of them weren't doing much. Eric Rowan was doing a Viking thing, but not really that into it. And they eventually became like his followers. And that was the first incarnation of Bray Wyatt and the Wyatt family. And I will say this on a personal note. I remember by that point I was watching NXT, was on Hulu. I remember watching the vignettes, watching him, and then he finally makes his debut, and I'm going, wow, this guy is now instantly one of my favorite wrestlers. Because it was so captivating, it was so great. He was doing like a Manson family type thing. And around this time, him and Samantha had their second daughter, Kendall. And it was very quickly after coming up with the Wyatt family that they make their main roster debut. Like, they weren't in NXT very long. I remember that as well. And very quickly, he gets into a feud with the top guy, John Cena. He gets into a program with John Cena that culminates at WrestleMania. Of course, John Cena won that match, but still, that's a big first year. But then it goes into how next year, at the next WrestleMania, he was having a feud with The Undertaker. Which, one thing I love about that, personally, is Bray Wyatt built that feud up all by himself. Like, this was one of the rare occasions. The Undertaker didn't come out and challenge Bray Wyatt. Bray Wyatt didn't challenge him face-to-face. They didn't have back-and-forth promo stuff going on. The Undertaker was absent until WrestleMania. All of the build-up was just Bray Wyatt, but it still built it up to the point you wanted to see it. And Mark Calloway, like I said earlier, he was doing the narration in this documentary, mentioned how this helped him very much. He was struggling with his confidence at the time, wondering if he still had it, and his match with Bray Wyatt definitely boosted his confidence that he really badly needed. Because if you remember, it was the year before that Brock Lesnar, of all people, broke that streak. And another note, not in this documentary, but Mark Calloway has gone on to say that of the people he felt should have broke his streak, he felt it should have been Bray Wyatt. Then after his WrestleMania match with The Undertaker, goes into him bringing in Braun Strowman. And it later goes into his very first WWE Championship victory. He was on top of the world, he's the champion, but it also increased his work schedule, and due to his schedule, his life on the road, it eventually did lead to the divorce of him and his wife, Samantha. Throughout the documentary, it made it clear that they stayed on good terms and everything. It was just a little much for her. But after a while, and it was a while, of him being broken up with Samantha, he did eventually start dating JoJo Offerman, who most people remember from the first season of Total Divas. She was the rookie, she was learning to become a wrestler, and that never panned out. She eventually became a ring announcer for a time. And they started dating, and they had his son, Nash. And not that long after, like 2 years later, they had his last daughter, Hyrie. And then it goes into how, yeah, the things with the Wyatt family were done. They needed something new, something exciting. And I'm glad they kind of skipped past the whole Deleters of World thing. That's one I like to forget, because that was really a drop-the-ball situation. Because Bray Wyatt versus Broken, Woken, whatever Matt Hardy they wanted to call him, that was a feud that could have been big. And for them to turn it into that lackluster tag team was terrible. But they did go into him creating the Firefly Funhouse. And that took it to a whole new level. One, the vignettes and stuff of the Pee-wee's Playhouse style thing with the weird creepy elements put in there. It was fantastic. It kept your attention, and it introduced The Fiend, which I remember my son walking by as I was watching wrestling. He saw The Fiend, and he instantly decided to sit down, and that was his favorite character from that point on. And it later goes into his next time feuding with John Cena, years later wanting to get back at him for taking away his spotlight at WrestleMania, and the Firefly Funhouse match, which came about because that was the year COVID hit. They couldn't have an audience. They were doing this from a performance center warehouse, but they decided, let's make this epic. Let's make this almost like a movie. And whereas it wasn't the best match as far as the actual fighting, it was 5-star entertainment. And soon after that, it goes into him bringing in Alexa Bliss, which I liked Alexa Bliss before the whole Funhouse thing. I liked her after the whole Funhouse thing. But I will say there was never a more interesting time for Alexa Bliss than when she was with Bray Wyatt in the Funhouse. That, to me, was just such another element, something we would never have expected from Alexa Bliss. And she pulled it off. And she credits him for being able to pull it off. But then this documentary goes into its first sad note when it talks about Bray Wyatt dealing with the death of John Huber, who was Luke Harper in the Wyatt family. At the time of his death, he was Mr. Brody Lee in AEW. And of course, it was really tough on Wyndham Rotunda. Then again, that death was really tough on a lot of people. John Huber was somebody that they all seemed to love. Then after it goes on that sad note, it goes into his frustrations creatively. That was the only complaints people would have about him, is he had an idea of what he wanted to do, and if it didn't measure up with what everybody else wanted to do, it would become frustrating for him, and it would in turn become frustrating for everybody. Goes into the Inferno match, which the match itself, I liked it. I thought it was good. It was entertaining, but obviously at the end, with it being the mannequin on fire and everything, it just seemed really fake. and he took some time off for that. And it goes into more of his frustrations creatively when they got to WrestleMania 37, and he went from being that, burnt up Fiend, transitioning back into the regular Fiend, which they had to do because there was no way he could wrestle in that gear. It was too heavy, it was too constrictive. But still, overall, that match, can't really say great things about it. It wasn't a really good match. That's when they had the turn over Alexa Bliss, and then we also just never got anything from it, though. Because very soon after, WWE released Wyndham Rotunda. And this documentary, kind of like in real life, never gave us any real reason why they would release, at the time, was their hottest superstar. Like, it alludes to the creative frustrations, but that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. How many more creative people did they get frustrated with, but they didn't release before? Like, it really was a dumb move. That, to this day, makes no sense to anybody. But then it goes into his time being released, how he got really into his art, painting and everything, and showed some of his art, and some of it's really good. And now that he's gone, I'm sure if they ever did decide to sell some of it, it would be very expensive. And it even goes into a reality show pilot he was doing with his brother Taylor. Didn't really go anywhere with it, but that how they both got to spend time together, and of course while they were spending all this time together, they're talking about wrestling. Neither of them are working with the company right now, but they're coming up with ideas again. He starts calling Triple H, he starts coming up with ideas for him to come back, which led to the White Rabbit vignettes. Which at first, I remember seeing them and we're all going like, what's going on? As time was going on more and more, we were like, is this Bray Wyatt? No, it's not Bray Wyatt. Is it Bray Wyatt? Maybe it's Bray Wyatt. Is it Bray Wyatt? And we were all excited when it turned out to be Bray Wyatt, and we found that out at the end of Extreme Rules. I remember watching that show because we all were given the hints that he was coming back at Extreme Rules. It was going to be great. And I remember the last match was ending, and I was like, but I thought Bray Wyatt was going to come back. But then they decided to do it after the main event, which in and of itself was awesome. And how that was going, and he even brought in his brother Taylor as Uncle Howdy, and their plan was to get to WrestleMania and work together at WrestleMania because that was their dream, to work together at WrestleMania. But it didn't pan out. In fact, he only had one match after coming back as the White Rabbit, Bray Wyatt, and that was against LA Knight at Royal Rumble, and then he got COVID. And whereas a lot of us got COVID, myself included, and nothing really happened. Don't get me wrong, it was one of the worst colds I ever had, but it was basically just a really bad cold on my end. It affected people differently. Some people it really badly affected, and he was one of them. It badly affected his heart. And of course they went into the details of that, how basically even after he had gotten over COVID itself, the damage to his heart was really bad. He'd get better, he'd get worse, he'd get better, he'd get worse. They even to the point gave him one of those vests that would shock his heart if it ever stopped for whatever reason. And they went into August 24th, the day that he died. This is where it gets incredibly emotional. They go into the full story of his passing. How he seemed okay. He even talked to his ex-wife that day and was all excited. He was going to go pick up his daughters from school, but he was going to go take a nap first, which was not unusual, especially at that point, with his heart problems, which is understandable. As somebody, I myself have heart problems, it wears you out. And it goes into the story from JoJo's perspective of her going in to wake him up because his alarm is going off for him to go pick up his daughters, and he's not waking up to it. And she goes into how she's at first just trying to wake him up, like, hey honey, wake up, shaking him, pushing him, to the point that she's hitting him, kicking him, screaming to get up because he's not responding. They call an ambulance, he goes to the hospital, they work on him. And Taylor Rotunda talking about what it was like for him and his family being in a room waiting to hear news, and he said it was like what you see in the movies, except something you couldn't understand unless you've been there, when they came in and told him that Wyndham was gone. And then after that, the documentary's not over. It's going into tributes, going into people like Braun Strowman talk about how he got the phone call while he was on the tarmac of a plane, and this big monster of a man falling to his knees and crying over losing his friend. Obviously, I can't go into all the different tributes, all the different things people said. There were so many people who had things to say. Alexa Bliss, Randy Orton, even Mark Calloway occasionally during the narration talking about his personal feelings on it. This was one of those guys that everybody seemed to love. And they even showed a model of what the next Fiend was going to look like that never actually came to. and the man who designed it, who was a good friend of his as well, going into the different intricacies of it, the little Easter eggs that he put on the Fiend costume for Wyndham, because Wyndham loved Easter eggs. Then comes the part that got really emotional for me. Now, before I say this, let me make this clear. I'm not saying this in the sense of like I'm a tough man's man kind of person. I'm not. But I don't usually cry during these kinds of things, documentaries, whatever. No matter how sad they get, I don't usually cry about them. But they did a small interview with his children. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm watching it and suddenly I notice there are tears coming down my eyes as his two oldest daughters are talking about their father, their memories of him, and how they want to continue for him, playing with his two younger kids who were 4 and 3 at the time of his death. It hit me in the feels. And then at the very, very end of the documentary, it goes into another little Easter egg where it shows a shadowy form of Uncle Howdy, giving us the hint that Taylor Rotunda might be coming back as Uncle Howdy. Who knows? I guess we'll see about that in the future. Of course, there's the rumors sparking that it's going to be at WrestleMania. But right now, we're talking about this particular documentary. It's emotional. Especially if you were a huge fan of Bray Wyatt like I was. Like I said, the moment I saw Bray Wyatt in NXT, the very first incarnation of it, I was like, this guy just debuted in my top 10 favorite wrestlers. And he stayed that way. This was a man that had such a creative mind. And as it turned out, not just in wrestling, but especially in wrestling, so creative. A man that could reinvent himself. A man that could keep coming back no matter how much they kept killing his characters and his momentum. Because they did. They would start going a direction that I can't blame him for being frustrated, because it would be stupid. It would be awful. And he would bounce back. They built up the Fiend for an entire year, then had him squashed by Goldberg, and he still came back strong. He was honestly like this current generation's version of The Undertaker. Just a very intriguing character who could find little and even big ways to reinvent himself. Would not get stale. And I remember in August finding out about his death and just being crushed. My son being crushed, because my son, that's what actually got him to start really watching wrestling with me, was the Fiend character. He loved it, and he was so sad to hear he was gone. It was definitely a too soon situation. There was so much more that could have been done with that character, so much more that could have been done with Bray Wyatt, and it got taken away from us too soon. Again, there's rumors that Taylor Rotunda is coming back and going to be doing his thing. Hopefully, I don't know if I want to say live up to, but hopefully this can be the boost he needs to keep Bray Wyatt's legacy alive. And I'm definitely thinking someday he is going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. Even though there was so much more he could have accomplished, he accomplished quite a bit. Now, I know I left a lot of the story out, especially a lot of the story of his death. You guys can go watch that yourselves. Because I do really, very highly recommend that you go to Peacock and check out the WWE Network original documentary of Bray Wyatt becoming immortal. So there you have it. That's my wrestling review this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell so you get notifications for when I post the videos, and leave a comment that can be answered in next week's Comment Corner. If you saw Bray Wyatt becoming immortal, tell me what you thought of it. Tell me your favorite Bray Wyatt memory. Love you guys.